First day inside death row. There is a moment, and every man who has ever lived it will tell you the same thing. When the door closes behind you and the sound of the outside world disappears completely. Not fades, disappears. Like it was never there. Like you were never there. That moment lasts about 3 seconds. And then the rest of your life begins. Before we proceed, kindly like, share, and subscribe. The transport protocol for death row inmates is deliberately designed to minimize contact with the general population. The van, usually a white or gray government vehicle with no markings beyond a state seal, enters through a dedicated intake bay that is physically separated from the rest of the institution. There are no windows on the inmate's side of the van. Some men will later say they had no idea how long the drive was, or even which direction they had been traveling. That disorientation is, in many ways, the first lesson the system teaches them. The individual emerging from that van is not yet what the institution will eventually make him. He is still in the last few hours of being a person who existed in the world. He had a trial. He had a sentencing. He has a name, a case number, and a sentence that ends in a way most legal documents try to phrase as carefully as possible. He may have family who attended the trial. He may have attorneys who shook his hand outside a courthouse. All of that is now architecturally, procedurally, and psychologically behind him. What happens inside the intake bay in the first 30 minutes tells you almost everything about how death row functions as a system. The incoming inmate is handed off from transport officers to institutional staff through a documented chain of custody, not unlike how evidence is transferred in a courtroom. Because that is what he is now, in the language of the institution. He is an item to be secured, catalogued, and stored. He is strip-searched. Every item he was wearing, including the clothing provided for transport, is removed, inspected, logged, and either destroyed or returned to family. He is given a medical screening, blood pressure, pulse, noted injuries, mental health flags. He signs documents he is given almost no time to read. He is issued bedding, 2 sheets, a blanket, a towel. He is issued a uniform. He is assigned a number. The number matters more than people outside the system tend to realize. Within the institution, the number is how requests are processed, how meals are allocated, how disciplinary records are filed, and how mail is routed. Some men on death row will go years before hearing a staff member use their actual name. Some never do. And through all of this, the stripping, the searching, the photographing, the numbering, the new arrival is expected to remain compliant. Still, cooperative. Any deviation from that, even a question asked in the wrong tone, is documented. On day 1, the file is already being built. What happens next was not the processing itself. It was the walk. The walk from intake to the death row housing unit is typically no more than 3 to 5 minutes in terms of physical distance. But for the men who have made that walk, it rarely felt like 3 to 5 minutes. Time behaves differently in a building where every sound echoes. The route passes through a series of secured doors, each one requiring a separate authorization. Either a physical key turned by an escorting officer, an electronic panel, or a remote-controlled mechanism operated by an officer in a control booth who watches through reinforced glass. Each door that opens and closes behind the new inmate is a diminishing of the world he came from. By the time he reaches the final door before the unit itself, he has passed through 6 or 7 of them. Each one makes the same sound. The death row unit in most state facilities is a self-contained structure within the larger institution. In some states, it is a dedicated building entirely. It has its own medical intake area, its own disciplinary structure, its own visiting protocol, and its own rules that exist alongside the general prison rulebook but superseded in a number of specific situations. It is, in every functional sense, a prison within a prison. The housing itself is typically a tiered cell block or a single-floor unit depending on the age of the facility. Cells are small. In most jurisdictions, the square footage of a death row cell ranges between 60 and 80 square feet. That is smaller than most residential bathrooms. Within those walls, a man will spend somewhere between 22 and 24 hours of every day, sometimes longer. When the new inmate enters the unit, something happens that no orientation document prepares him for. The existing residence notice. They always notice. A man who has been on death row for 6 years once described the first arrival of a new inmate this way. He said the whole unit changes its pitch. Not its volume, its pitch. The conversations that were happening continue, but something underneath them shifts. Men who were not paying attention are suddenly paying attention. Not because they are hostile, though some are, but because a new person entering death row is one of the rarest events those walls ever see. The average death row unit does not have the turnover of general population housing. Men arrive rarely, and when they leave in one of two ways. They are either executed, or in a smaller number of cases, they are exonerated or resentenced. What this means in practical terms is that the men already on the unit have often been there for years, sometimes decades. They know every face. They know every voice. They know the sound of every officer's keys. They know which light in the corridor flickers twice before going steady. They know things that a human being only knows when their entire sensory world has been compressed into a space the size of a parking space. And they see the new arrival the way anyone sees a newcomer to a closed world, with everything they have. What the new inmate does in those first minutes inside the unit will be remembered. Not necessarily acted upon, but remembered. Does he walk with his head up or down? Does he look at the cells as he passes them? Or does he stare straight ahead? Does he react when someone speaks to him from behind a door? Or does he keep moving? Every choice is being evaluated, not by violent men looking for a target, though that exists in some facilities. More often, it is being evaluated by men who have nothing but time and therefore pay the kind of attention to human behavior that most people living free lives have completely forgotten how to pay. The new inmate is escorted to his cell. The cell has been cleaned, though the definition of clean within an institution means something different than it does anywhere else. There's a steel bed frame bolted to the wall with a mattress that is thinner than anything sold in a store. There's a stainless steel toilet and sink combination unit in the corner. There's a small shelf. There may or may not be a small window. In some facilities, the window is no larger than a mail slot, set high in the wall, and in certain cells it faces nothing but another concrete wall. The door closes. The escort officer's footsteps recede, and that is when the real first day begins. Because everything before that door closing was still the institution processing him. What comes after the door closing is entirely his own problem to survive. The first hours alone in a death row cell are documented in memoirs, in psychological studies, in letters written to family members, and in the testimony of men who were later exonerated and were willing to speak about it. And across all of those sources, a strange consistency emerges. Almost none of the men describe thinking about their sentence during those first hours. Almost none of them describe thinking about the trial, or the crime they were convicted of, or the person they lost, or the family they left behind. What they describe thinking about is something far more immediate and, in some ways, far more unsettling. They describe noticing the sounds. The ventilation system, present in every modern institutional facility, produces a low, constant hum that is almost impossible to describe to someone who has not heard it. It is not loud. It is not intrusive in the way a siren or an alarm is intrusive. It simply exists, without pause, without variation, without end. Men who have been on death row for years say they stopped hearing it eventually. Men in their first hours say it was the loudest thing in the world. Beyond the ventilation, there are the voices. Death row units are, despite their reputation for silence, rarely actually silent. Men talk to each other through doors, through walls, through the gaps around pipes, through the spaces where institutional architecture creates unintended sound pathways. A man in one cell might carry on a conversation with someone 3 cells away at a volume that requires no shouting because the sound travels through the building structure itself. New inmates often describe hearing conversations they cannot source, voices that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. And then there are the officers. The death row unit is staffed continuously. Officers conduct rounds at regular intervals, which vary by facility and shift. In some institutions, rounds happen every 30 minutes. In others, every 15. The officer walks the corridor, checks each cell visually, records the observation, and moves on. Some officers knock on the door as they pass. Some do not. but the sound of the rounds, the footsteps approaching, pausing, and then retreating, becomes a rhythm that death row inmates often say they internalize so completely that they could track the time of day from it more accurately than from any clock. Time becomes the central problem of death row faster than anything else. It arrives as a crisis within the first 24 hours for most men. Not because they lack ways to pass it. They do, eventually, develop systems, but because in the first 24 hours, they have not yet built those systems. They have nothing. They sit with the full, unmediated weight of time in a space the size of a parking spot, and they have to find some way to exist inside that. What many of them reach for first, almost instinctively, is the most basic form of control available to them. They begin to clean the cell. The behavioral science behind this is not complicated, but it is profound. When a person's environment reduces their controllable variables to near zero, when they cannot decide when to sleep, when to eat, when to leave, when to speak, when light enters the room, the mind instinctively hunts for something it can determine. Cleaning the cell, which may have arrived clean already, is not about cleanliness. It is about the act of deciding, of doing something that produces a visible, measurable result, of existing in the world as a cause rather than only an effect. This impulse, this reaching for microcontrol, is one of the first signs that a person's survival psychology is activating. And it is, paradoxically, one of the healthiest things a new death row inmate can do. The men who do not reach for it in those first hours tend to be the ones who struggle hardest in the weeks that follow. The daily schedule on death row is not arbitrary, though it may feel that way to someone new to it. It is built around institutional necessity and, in some facilities, around court mandates that require a minimum level of out-of-cell time and access to certain services. The general structure across most U.S. death row units looks roughly like this. Wake-up is early, usually between 5 and 5:30 in the morning, and is announced by lights being turned on in the corridor or PA announcement. Breakfast is delivered to the cell. Lunch follows at midday. Dinner in the late afternoon, often before 4 o'clock, because the institutional kitchen runs on a schedule that has nothing to do with the preferences of the men it feeds. Out-of-cell time, called recreation, though the word carries a bitterness inside the institution, typically amounts to 1 hour per day in states that meet minimum standards. In some facilities, this hour occurs in a small outdoor cage, sometimes called a dog run or an exercise yard, that is open to the sky but enclosed on all sides and above by chain link or steel mesh. In other facilities, particularly those operating under modified lockdown, out-of-cell time happens in a slightly larger interior room. Either way, it is 1 hour. In a 24-hour day, that is less than 5% of their time. The new inmate receives this information not from any formal orientation. Death row onboarding is not the kind of process that involves a welcome packet, but from the existing population. How that information transfer happens is one of the more quietly remarkable aspects of the death row experience. Death row is often imagined as a place of absolute silence and isolation, where men exist in total separation from one another. The reality is more complex, and in some ways more disturbing. There is a social architecture inside a death row unit that exists entirely in the invisible spaces, the gaps beneath doors, the channels through walls, the carefully managed interactions that occur during the brief windows of out-of-cell time. It is a society that has built itself out of the materials available to it, which are time, voice, proximity, and need. The men who have been on the unit longest hold the most social authority, not necessarily through force or threat, though enforcement mechanisms do exist, but through the simple and undeniable power of knowledge. They know which officers can be reasoned with and which ones will write you up for nothing. They know which part of the law library request process actually works and which part of it is bureaucratic theater. They know which meal is going to be inedible before it arrives. They know how to get a message to someone in a different part of the unit without it being intercepted. They know things that took years to learn, and the new inmate needs most of that knowledge within his first week. The transmission of this knowledge is not charitable in the sentimental sense. It is practical. A new inmate who does not understand the rules, both the written ones and the unwritten ones, creates problems for everyone. He might respond to an officer in a way that triggers a lockdown. He might misunderstand a communication from another inmate and respond in a way that causes conflict. He might ask for something through the wrong channel and draw attention to systems that the population has cultivated carefully. Getting the new man oriented is not an act of kindness. It is an act of institutional self-preservation by the community that already exists there. What he is told, usually through voice through the wall or folded message slid under a door, covers a specific set of priorities. Which officers log everything and which ones have discretion. How to request medical attention without it being dismissed. How to handle the feeling, and it will come, he is told, of the walls closing in. What to do when panic arrives in the middle of the night when the unit is at its quietest. That last piece of advice is perhaps the most important thing anyone tells him on the first day. And it is almost always the most impossible to follow. Night on death row is not dark. This is one of the first things new inmates report being unprepared for. Institutional facilities maintain some level of lighting in the corridors throughout the night, usually a reduced emergency lighting system. And enough of that light enters the cell through the door's observation window or the narrow gap at the bottom that the cell is never in complete darkness. There is something about partial darkness that is more difficult for many people than total darkness. Total darkness is enveloping. It has edges. It ends when the light comes back. Partial darkness offers enough visibility to remind you exactly where you are, without offering enough to distract you from it. The first night is when the sentence becomes real for most men. Not the verdict that was real in the courtroom. Not the legal reality of what is coming. Most men on death row wait years, sometimes decades, through appeals processes that are long and often quietly hopeless. What becomes real on the first night is something more specific than the sentence. What becomes real is the tomorrow. Not the distant future. Not the execution, if it ever comes. Tomorrow. The next 24 hours, which will look exactly like the 24 hours just completed. The same wake-up. The same food delivered through the door slot. The same hour of recreation in the same small space. The same ventilation hum. The same rounds at the same intervals. And the day after that. And the day after that. This is what the psychological literature on long-term solitary confinement and death row incarceration identifies as the primary mental health challenge. Not the dramatic, acute crisis, but the grinding, structural, repetitive sameness that stretches from the first day forward without visible end. The human mind is not built to process infinity. It needs horizon lines, events to anticipate, changes to look forward to, transitions that mark time. When those are removed, the mind begins to do things to compensate that are not always healthy. Some men begin to count days, weeks, meals. Some men develop elaborate mental rituals, exercises performed in exact sequence, prayers repeated in specific orders, mental lists compiled and refined across years. Some men write letters, not to send, but because writing is a form of time that moves forward. Some men sleep as much as possible, not because they are tired, but because sleep is the one remaining way to make time pass quickly. And some men do none of these things. Some men spend the first night, and many nights after it, trying to hold on to the sound of a specific voice. A child's voice. A mother's voice. Something from the outside world that still exists in the biological memory of the air, if you are quiet enough and focused enough to find it. That particular coping mechanism is one of the most human things documented inside death row. And it is also, according to the men who used it and eventually lost it, one of the most devastating things that can happen. The day when you try to hear that voice in your memory and it has gone quiet. That day, they say, is worse than the first. The formal disciplinary system on death row is one of the most significant power structures a new inmate has to learn, and learn quickly. Within the institution, staff members have the authority to issue what are called disciplinary reports, sometimes referred to as tickets, write-ups, or incident reports depending on the facility. These are formal documents that record a violation of institutional rules and initiate a process that can result in a range of consequences. Loss of recreation time. Loss of commissary access. Loss of visitation privileges. Transfer to a more restrictive housing condition. And in some facilities, the loss of accumulated good time credits. Though for men already sentenced to death, this last one carries a particular irony that is not lost on anyone. What new inmates often fail to understand, and what the existing population usually tries to communicate quickly, is that the disciplinary system is not simply punitive. It is also architectural. It is how the institution maintains control over a population that it cannot manage through the ordinary incentives available in general population housing. Parole is not an incentive. Good time credits have limited meaning. The carrots available to general population corrections, earlier release, better housing assignments, more freedom, do not apply in the same way to men sentenced to die. What the disciplinary system can do is take away the small things. And on death row, the small things are everything. A man loses his recreation hour and he loses his one daily exposure to something that is not his cell. A man loses commissary access and he loses his ability to supplement the institutional food with anything that tastes like something he chose. A man loses visitation and he loses his most direct human contact with the world outside the walls. The small things are not small inside a space where they constitute the entirety of what remains. Officers who work death row for any length of time develop an understanding of this leverage that shapes how they use it. Some use it sparingly and strategically, as genuine correction rather than punishment. Some use it as a form of personal authority. The new inmate, who has no track record inside the unit, no established relationship with staff, and no knowledge of the informal norms that have developed over years, is in the most vulnerable position with respect to this system. The advice from the population is consistent. In the first 30 days, comply with everything. Do not test anything. Do not ask questions that sound like challenges. Do not react to provocations. Build the record quietly and carefully, because the record is the one asset that can be constructed even from inside a locked cell. But the advice and the execution of that advice are two different things, especially when a man is sleep-deprived, frightened, disoriented, and processing a grief that has no name. The psychological effects of death row confinement have been studied extensively, and the findings are not subtle. Prolonged isolation combined with constant uncertainty about the timeline and nature of one's death creates a specific psychological profile that researchers have described as a kind of suspended dying. The person is not actively dying, but they are not living in the way that sustains psychological health. They exist in a space between those two states for which the English language has no single adequate word. Studies conducted across multiple institutions and across several decades have documented elevated rates of depression, anxiety disorders, paranoid ideation, and what is sometimes called hypervigilance, an extreme sensitivity to environmental cues that develops when a person's survival depends on reading every available signal with precision. Death row inmates can often tell you, without looking at a clock, what time it is to within 15 minutes. They can identify individual officers by the sound of their footsteps at distances of 30 feet or more. They notice changes in the routine, a meal arriving 5 minutes late, a light in the corridor replaced with a brighter bulb, with an acuity that would be impressive in other contexts. This hypervigilance is adaptive in a limited sense. It keeps them alert in an environment where alertness has value. But it is also exhausting in a way that compounds over time. To be constantly tracking, constantly assessing, constantly on the edge of sensory attention, over months and years, that state of readiness without any action to take begins to consume the mind from the inside. The men who resist this erosion most successfully tend to share certain characteristics. They find a purpose that extends beyond survival. For many, that purpose is their legal case, the appeals process, the possibility, however remote, of a different outcome. For some, it is religious practice, not necessarily the performative kind, but the kind that creates an internal architecture of meaning that the institution cannot reach. For others, it is intellectual discipline, reading, writing, learning, treating the cell as a place where the mind can move even when the body cannot. And for a few, it is the act of witnessing, of being present and conscious and observant inside an experience that most people on the outside will never access and can only imagine. There are men on death row who have written accounts of their experience with the precision and clarity of documentary filmmakers, not out of self-importance, but out of a conviction that what happens inside those walls deserves to be known. That the experience, however terrible, has value as evidence of something important about the society that created it. This is not a comfortable conclusion to sit with. It was not meant to be. By the end of the first week, the new inmate has begun to develop a map of the world he is in. It is not a complete map. It will take months, sometimes years, to fill in all its features. But the basic geography has emerged. He knows which officer will stop and speak with him if he approaches the door during a round, and which one will log the observation and keep walking. He knows approximately what the food will be on any given day of the week because the menu cycles and does not deviate. He knows the sound the unit makes at 2 in the morning, which is different from the sound it makes at 6 in the morning, which is different again from the sound it makes during the 10-minute window when cell doors are briefly controlled for some administrative purpose and the ambient tension shift perceptibly in response. He has begun to build his time. Not with anything elaborate yet. The elaborate systems come later. But he has established some basic structure, when he will do the small amount of physical exercise possible in his space, when he will sleep, when he will be awake and alert, when he will try to read or write if he has obtained access to materials. And he has begun to understand, in the bone-deep way that only direct experience teaches, what the long-term residents of the unit were telling him in those first hours. That the days are not the danger. The days have structure. The days have meals and rounds and recreation and the small tasks he has assigned himself. The days can be managed. It is the nights that require everything he has. The nights when the unit goes to its quietest, and the ventilation hum becomes the world's only sound, and the rectangle of pale light on the ceiling from the corridor outside holds absolutely still, and the mind, no longer distracted by the small tasks and sounds and social negotiations of the day, turns toward the things it has been carrying since the door first closed. The sentence, the loss, the faces of people he loves, arranged in the particular way they appeared on a specific ordinary day before any of this began. The question that has no answer and that he will spend every night of his life inside those walls not answering. What might it have been? That question does not go away. It does not go quiet. It simply becomes, with time, one of the features of the landscape. Like the ventilation hum, like the rectangle of light, like the sound of the officer's keys on the midnight round, part of the permanent geography of the world he now lives in. Death row in the United States currently houses more than 2,000 people. Some of them have been there for more than 30 years. A small number have been exonerated and walked out. Some have been executed. Many remain in that condition the researchers call suspended dying, alive, present, enduring, inside a system that was built around a sentence that has not yet been carried out. Überall, return to the interior corridor, the same hallway from the cold open, the same officer walking away from camera, but now shot from a different angle, slightly wider, the camera positioned at a lower level, as though the hallway itself has grown. Every one of those individuals had a first day. Every one of them experienced the door closing for the first time, and the sound of the world disappearing, and the beginning of the rest of whatever their life would be. The question that sits beneath all of the documentation, the psychological studies, the architectural descriptions, the testimonies of men who lived it and the officers who watched them live it, is not a legal question or a political one, though it bleeds into both. It is a more basic question, one that any person, sitting quietly and honestly with the information this account has provided, will eventually arrive at on their own. It is the question of what we believe we are doing when we build a place like this, and what we become, as the people who built it, every single day that it continues to exist. That question has no door that locks it out. It goes wherever you take it.